Velkommen alle sammen til vores fredagsseminar. Og i dag der har vi vores egen PhD-studerende, Christina Videbech, som skal fremlægge om sit PhD-projekt, og hun er snart færdig. Og Christina, hun skriver om døde ting fra Rom og Forum Romanum og Forum Traiani. Og Peterskirken, så det er det, vi kommer til at høre om. Men tusind tak, Christina, for at du vil være med i dag, og vi ser frem til at lytte til det, du har at fortælle os.
Thank you, and I will speak in English because I was told to speak in English, and maybe there's someone online here and Daniela is. I will start by...
Just gonna 1 second. The microphone isn't working, so if you could use this one. You give me that. Thanks. Sorry.
Okay. It's working now?
Yeah.
Yes, cool. Okay, anyway. So I'm sorry for the quality of the picture here, but unfortunately that's the only picture that I could actually get. And I wanted to begin by introducing you to this dead woman in the forum, because she is really, really central to my project, actually, which can seem a little bit strange since I'm working in very, very big architectural spaces. But I think she is just as important as the temples and the curia and all the other buildings that I'm looking at. This woman was buried around the middle of the 6th century in the area connected with the Forum Romanum and very closely related to a church in the area. Her grave was not the only grave. It was part of a little cemetery of around 10 graves with 13 individuals. So yeah, they were kind of put on top of each other. Both sexes and many different age groups was represented in this graveyard. Her grave was, as you might see from the picture, there's nothing extravagant about it. There's not a big monument. There was not even a gravestone. There was no real, well, there was a little bit of grave goods, but nothing extravagant at all. We can't really determine if she was Christian or not. This is a period of time in Rome's history where she could be pagan or Christian. We will go back to that later. But we might think that she was Christian since she was buried near a church, so it makes sense. And also in the 6th century, the majority of Rome's population was probably Christian as well. It's possible that hymns would have been sung while she was buried. It's also possible that prayers were offered of some kind. Maybe there would be a small funerary dinner. That would make sense because that was tradition at the time, to make a funerary dinner for the family who would eat, and then they would possibly leave some of the things behind from the funerary dinner, some of the food and the waste. But to be honest, we have no idea. We don't know anything that she was a middle-aged woman buried in this area. But what we do know is that this woman's grave and the other graves in the area was one of the consequences of what was happening in Rome at the time, because things were really, really changing between the 4th to the 6th century. Until this point of time, it had been strictly forbidden to actually bury people inside the city. There were rules, and I think even maybe on the penalty of death for burying people inside the city limit. But somehow this must have changed, because here we are, obviously. So this shows that the city was changing, and maybe the needs of the inhabitants in Rome was changing, and therefore they were transforming the city, changing the city to fit their new needs, in this case graves. Graves such as this in a highly monumental space, it would, the equivalent would be people burying, the dead ones outside this museum, or maybe inside this museum. It seems kind of strange. And it could also be taken as some sort of decline of the city or the city space. And it has been, because it doesn't really look good, right, to be honest, having dead people all around a space that was, until that point of time, very monumental. But I would actually argue that that is the wrong way to look at it. Even though this is normally how people see it, that, okay, the society and Roman society was breaking down, I don't think that's right. I don't think that we should be dazzled by impressive monuments to think that evidence like this grave or like waste or similar things is a bad thing. Yes, as I said, it's not very pretty, but it's still interesting, and it shows that the city was still being used. Whether we like the use or not is another question, but people were definitely there. And it shows that inhabitants could actually change these places, and not just the elite that we usually hear of. We will hear about them today also, bishops and emperors, rulers, that sort of stuff, but also by the people like you and me, just being in the city. And I would therefore argue that evidence like this woman's grave is key to understanding how Rome was developing in this century. And therefore we cannot just park it in the, the parking space of decline. We need to actually confront it and look at it on its own terms. And this is actually one of the main arguments of my PhD, and the PhD I want to present for you today. So before we start, I just wanted to give a very short introduction to my PhD. This is the title, as you can see. If you are not that strong in Latin, it means, where are you going, Roman? Because that is basically what my PhD is about. Where were people going and what were they doing, the places they went? So my PhD consists of 4 articles, as you can see here. They're in different stages of publications. And then there's a synopsis which kind of draws on all these articles and discuss everything. It's called the Cape in Norwegian, and that actually makes sense because it's drawing everything together. However, before we go further into what I found in my PhD, I would like to give you a little bit of background info, because I know at least the people sitting in this room maybe are not so familiar with Roman history. So I would like to give you just a small outline of what was actually going on in Rome at this point of time, because that's very, very important. I think you can't just remove these spaces or even Rome from what was happening in the Roman world at this point of time. So let's move into it. Because if we return for a minute to that dead woman in the Forum, she was actually living through very, very interesting times. A lot of things were going down between these 2 years. There were both disastrous events, and you will hear a lot about those, but there was also gradual change going on in Rome. So, as I said, I want to provide you with a little bit of background info, and I will give you a very short outline, and it's going to be very fast, very quick, so please buckle up and listen carefully. Of course, if you have any questions to any of this afterwards, you are welcome to ask. So, if we look at the city of Rome, by the 4th century, around 312, when we enter the city, so to speak, it was not the capital of the Roman Empire anymore. And emperors like Constantine here would not really be there. They would visit the city occasionally, but they would like to be in other cities instead, like Constantinople, for example, which had become the new capital of at least the Eastern Roman Empire. So this meant that the city was its role, its symbolic role in the Roman world was changing rapidly, from being the political headquarter of the empire to becoming something less, much more vague, more symbolic instead. So this did not mean, I wouldn't want to say that this meant that emperors forgot Rome, because what we can see also in the 3 spaces that I am going to talk mostly about today is that emperors were actually still very attentive to Rome. They would restore things, they would build monuments. Constantine is a very good example. For example, they would build the Basilica of St. Peter, that is one of our main locations today. And in those things, these buildings and monuments, statues and so on, they would be visible to the Roman people coming there. It would be like, yes, I'm still here, because at least I have a statue. Also, these big churches, and there were several of them, the Basilica of St. Peter was just one of several big churches in the city at the time, were also a very, very clear visualization of the fact that by now the emperor and the empire was gradually becoming Christian. There would be some hit and misses along the way, but people were getting more and more Christianized, and as I said, by the 6th century, most people would be Christian. I don't think you could really emphasize enough how important that was, that the religion, all the religions was kind of gradually, what's it called? Christianity was taking over their role in the Roman Empire, especially when we look at the Forum Romanum, or the Forum Traiani for that matter, which is very closely connected to pagan religion. What happens with such a space when suddenly the religion in there is illegal, even in some cases? So that meant that Rome at this point of time was increasingly becoming the Christian capital of the world, while it was losing its political capital role of the world. And this would also change city topography, because as this happened, then people would change from going, as I said, where are you going, Roman? They would not go to the fora as much, but they would go to the churches instead. And what kind of influence did that have on city topography? That was also one of my questions. So now it was time to paganism to face restrictions and sometimes persecution as well. In Rome, we do not have direct or clear evidence of persecutions. There might have been a little bit of pagan people, but it was most definitely something was changing, and now it was Christians who had power and not pagans. But nevertheless, despite all these religious troubles that was going on, it was actually, the 4th century was a nice century to live in for Rome. So it was generally prosperous and it was generally peaceful. Unfortunately, the 5th century was not as peaceful, to say the least. What happened during this century was that Rome was sacked several times. The first time was in 410. This is not actual footage, by the way. It was first sacked in 410. This sack was extremely important symbolically. We can see it in written sources that people are talking about the capital of the world has fallen. What are we to do with ourselves? But looking at it, from hindsight, we can actually see that while it was very important to in the written sources, this was not the end of the world. Some written sources claim it was, but it wasn't. We can see that in other sources. Rome would gradually, become Rome again. Things would be restored. Emperors, aristocrats would make everything look more or less as it had been before. And also, we can't see a direct influence on the population of Rome. People still lived there. The people who must have left, because it was probably not completely funny being there during this sack, they actually came back. So the city of Rome came back, but there was the occasional earthquake, the flood here and there, and sickness and all that sort of stuff they had to battle with. Unfortunately, in 455, they had a new sack, this time by another king, a barbarian king. What happened after this was that Italy entered a period where there would be a lot of, Western emperors in very rapid succession. They would kind of cooperate with military men, and then they would gain power, and then they would be killed, and then, the whole circle of power, at least at this point of time. In the end, this led to the rise of Odoacer, who deposed the last Western emperor in 476. So this year you probably have heard about before. This is what normally is called the fall of the Western Empire, because this is the last time we have a Roman emperor residing in Rome. You have Odoacer here. Again, this is not actual footage of what went on. But the fact is that Odoacer, even though it was, this is a very important event, and we didn't have any emperors after this, Odoacer would rule Rome with the old aristocracy. So you could discuss how prominent this year actually was for the people living in Rome, if they would actually see the big difference. The man in the street would probably not be that much affected of it. However, that being said, around the same period, something else happened, possibly something else. We're not sure that if it was connected to one of the sacks or if it was a completely unrelated event, but we can see that the population in Rome is declining rapidly. This can, for example, be seen in the fact that houses, usually aristocratic houses, was left Some of them was burned down, and they were never used again for aristocratic use. So there's definitely something going on here, but we're not sure that we can connect it to these two last sacks. So while all this was going on, and Odoacer, he was ruling in Rome, and everything was going more or less as it used to. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, the Eastern Emperor was less than satisfied with this barbaric rule in Italy. So what he thought was he wanted to send another man, and he chose, maybe unwisely, another barbarian, Theodoric. Theodoric had lived for a time in Constantinople, so he was probably less barbaric, than what they had in Italy by then. But no matter what, he went to Italy, and to make a very long story short, Odoacer was murdered, he became king of Italy, and then we sort of just had the same story one more time. So Theodoric, he took over, and he began his own dynasty, the Amal dynasty, and most sources, both archaeological and epigraphical and written sources, actually agree that this was a prosperous time for Rome. It was like, some even go as far as calling it a second golden age. I don't know if I would take it that far, but there's definitely proof or evidence that should suggest that it was going quite okay in Rome. And at least officially, Theodoric, he kind of proclaimed that he wanted to continue Roman rule and everything should be fine and be good and even better than it had been before. He actually uses a lot of time to talk about how he would do stuff better than the Roman emperors have done before him. Unfortunately, at some point of time, he died, because that's what people do, dead things, right? And unfortunately, his successors did not fare as well as Theodoric had done. And to make, again, a very long story short, Game of Thrones could have been written about this period. It wasn't, as far as I know, but it could have, because, boy, stuff was going on. In the end, Theodoric's daughter, Amalasuntha, was murdered. And then Justinian, again, an Eastern emperor, thought, this is my time to shine. And then he cast himself as the hero who was going to rescue Italy. And he began the Gothic Wars, which might have looked very good on paper, but in reality that really sucked, to be honest. The wars ran between 535 and 554, and Italy and Rome was utterly ravaged by this time. Rome was sacked again and again, repeatedly, because everyone wanted Rome, and then they destroyed the city in the process. And there was definitely brutality on both sides. So the Goths were not really doing well. The mass executions was just their thing at the time. But the Romans were not doing that good either. So in the end, I think as a citizen in Rome or an inhabitant in Rome, you might have thought, well, who to choose? Because it's like literally, the best of two evils here. In the end, Justinian won, and the Rome was incorporated into the Eastern Empire. But unfortunately, because of this war, because of all the things that was going on, I think some of you might know the year 536. I know that means a lot to Norwegian archaeologists. This was during these years, and there was a lot of floods and earthquakes and everything. And in the end, the plague came. Here, you see the rat. So it was a pretty trying times to live in Rome, to be honest. And all of this, the continued warfare, the people who was doing the war would change a little bit, but war would continue into the 7th century, plague would continue into the 7th century, earthquakes, floods, everything. So it was basically not, if I should choose a time to go back to, I would not choose this. And I guess that many of you are sitting right now and thinking the same thing, that you're very happy you are not in the shoes of the dead woman who was buried in the Forum. And to be honest, yes, this sucked. It sucked to be a Roman inhabitant. For much of this period, there was a lot of change happening in the 4th to the 6th century. But what I want to argue, and what I want you to keep in mind when we're talking about my project in a second, is that even though it could look like this from hindsight, Rome was not changed because of external forces hitting the city. Rome was not changed because there was plague or there was floods or there was earthquakes or that sort of stuff. Rome was changed because there was people inside of Rome who reacted to these events. And this is my main point and the main focus of my PhD project that I now want to turn to. However, very, very early on, I realized that studying all of Rome during this period was probably a mouthful. So I decided to go with 3 places. I have already introduced them very shortly to you. So it was the Forum Traiani, the Forum Romanum, and the Basilica of St. Peter. These places were all places that were very central to Roman history, Roman self-understanding, religion, and of course government. They all had a long history of continuous use, which was important for me because I wanted to look at the development of these sites. And then they represented 3 different epochs of Rome's history. So, for example, we have the old traditional history, Forum Romanum. We have the Roman Empire at its high point, Forum Traiani, and then we have the future of Rome in the St. Peter's Basilica. And also, as a PhD student, these 3 places had another advantage, and that was the fact that many people have studied these places before me, which means that we have a very clear idea of their architectural layout, the evidence. There has been a lot of excavations, so there has been compiled this massive amount of data and interpretations of how these spaces looked. And that could, that could kind of form the necessary base for the comparison that I wanted to do. Without that sort of investigation before my study, it would simply not be possible because they are huge sites. But to introduce them very, very quickly, this is probably the place you know the best, Forum Romanum, the heart of the ancient city. It was from the earliest times of the Roman Empire, the administrative and symbolic center of Rome. And during late antiquity, the area was still symbolically important, but as I said, Rome was not the political capital as it used to be. Then, of course, this place as the heart of the political capital also lost some of its importance in that respect, but it was still, as I said, very important symbolically. And furthermore, I also want you to keep in mind that, as I said in the beginning, this was a place very, very closely tied to pagan religion, and that was, of course, also very important in a period where pagan religion was, well, removed. Moving on to the adjacent Forum Traiani, that was inaugurated in 112. You can see different pictures of it here. The column you had here, that was actually, it was both the Victory Monument, but it was also the grave of the founder, one of the legendary emperors of Rome, Trajan. During Hadrian's reign, which was a subsequent emperor, the Forum would also, it would be supplemented with nearby structures such as the temple in honor of Trajan and Plotina, but also the structures of the so-called Athenaeum of Hadrian. From its inauguration, it's very clear that this forum was closely connected to legal activities, publishing laws and that sort of stuff. There might have been some religion as well, but the evidence is not really clear on that. But as we move into the period of this study, the 4th century and the 5th century, it increasingly became a place for the elite of Rome, and I'm talking about the top elite, to kind of display themselves, put up statues and display themselves as the victors of Rome and the victors of the Roman Empire. And also, of course, the whole forum, as it was a victory monument in itself, celebrating Roman victory, a specific victory over Dacia by Trajan, but also just generally Roman supremacy in contrast to other people in the world at the time. So, the last location was the Basilica of St. Peter. It was one of the most potent symbols of Christianity in Rome. Not the only one, but one of them. It was built during the first part of the 4th century. We don't know exactly who built it, but we do know it was an emperor. Most people think it was Constantine, but we're not sure about it. But what is important here is that it was an emperor who built this, because I think most of you might know this, the modern church today, as the papal church, the papal church. And I want to really emphasize, at this point of time, it wasn't the papal church. It was an imperial church and an imperial space. Yes, so I already mentioned that all of these places have been subjects of impressive scholarship, resulting in a very thorough knowledge on the archaeology and the architecture and the sculpture. And it was never my intention to just do that research once more. I thought, we need to move on by now. So what I wanted to focus on human actors in Rome and how these people used these 3 spaces between 312 and 630. And I wanted to analyze the evidence of both archaeology, epigraphical sources and written sources, and compare what they actually claimed. Then I wanted to document the development of these 3 spaces' use and the different actors who were present in these spaces. I wanted to see if, for example, all these spaces were imperial spaces to begin with. Would that continue throughout the period? Or would it mean something that the emperor was leaving? Would new actors be introduced to the spaces? And could I see this in the sources, and in which sources, and what did it mean? And then I wanted to analyze and compare and interpret the collected data in a temporal and spatial framework, as well as a theoretical framework based on resilience theory, collective memory, and sociological theory on activity spaces. And my idea was that by using these 3 theories, combining them, it would be possible to consider the development of these 3 places as a gradual adaptive process, but also formed by disasters here and there. I didn't want to kind of downplay the fact that there was disasters in this period, because there obviously was, but I also wanted to look at the greater mechanisms at play. And then it provided an opportunity to focus on how memory could be applied innovatively, resulting in the adaptation of these 3 locations and their consequent resilience. And also I wanted to analyze the opposite, when memory didn't work in advantage, when memory kind of stopped a place from adapting and then held it back in the past, and therefore impaired the resilience of a space. So therefore my focus was not, as I said, on the architectural layout, but on what the material and written sources could tell us about, as I said, the people who used them. And I wanted to see what they used them for, and was there some sort of development in this use? What was deemed appropriate? What could I see, for example, in the, let's take the dead woman as an example. From the written sources, I knew she was not supposed to be there. But from the archaeological sources, I could see she most definitely was. So how does this work? And was it a single piece, a single time this happened, or did it happen regularly, and that sort of stuff? And by doing this, I actually, to just put it very, very simple, I hoped to kind of revive these 3 places. We were talking about dead things. We're looking at dead things as archaeologists, but I actually wanted to do the opposite. I wanted to see the living people, or the living city behind these dead places, and then maybe even contradict some of these very white pictures that we get from modern reconstructions of these places. They're so beautiful, so pristine, but in the end, is that really how it was? That's a rhetorical question, by the way. But I wanted to do something else as well, because I wanted to look at the archaeological, the epigraphical, and the written sources equally, regardless of their size or aesthetic. So I wanted to look at it as evidence of actions, but it didn't matter if it was the action of, erecting a monument, or the action of throwing waste in the street. That would just figure as actions in my study, because both things were done by people, and in the end it was these people that I was interested in. And by doing this, I hope that I could move on, because these spaces, as I said, they have been studied very, very much, but mostly because we look at monuments, we look at sculptures. That is the art of rulers or aristocrats, the elite of society. And I wanted to include someone else as well. I wanted to look at a broader range of Rome's inhabitants and see, did they use these spaces? Could I find evidence of the normal Roman, or the well-off Roman, as I ended up calling them? And I realized that the majority of you being here are prehistoric archaeologists, and you're probably thinking, duh, obviously, normal people, because that's what you look at. But actually with these three spaces, I'm not saying that generally in Roman archaeology we don't look at normal people, because that would not be true, but these three spaces have generally not been studied as places of the daily life of Rome, because there is so many monuments there, there's so many political, historical events that we can actually place in these spaces, so they have kind of taken the attention. But my argument is that now it's time to look further. So the actors I ended up studying in the three locations was, of course, the rulers, emperors and kings. You have met one of them down in the corner there. These people were mostly physically absent from Rome, but that didn't mean they didn't impact Rome in any way, because, as I said, they would erect monuments and they would rule the city through the aristocracy who were in the spaces, the local people. And of course, we needed to look at them as well, the aristocrats. This was a heterogeneous group. They were ranked based on birth, on wealth, on political office. They were the absolute political elite of Rome. And also a little fun fact, during the Gothic Wars that you have heard about, this group was targeted specifically through mass executions and that sort of stuff, which of course, understandably ended up with people fleeing the city, this group fleeing. And my thought was, if this group is suddenly the group that is most visible in many of our sources, if they're suddenly gone, then who's left? And how can we see those? One of the people who was left was this guy, or actually two of them here, bishops. And of course, the core role of the bishop was to kind of represent God on earth and lead people in the Christian faith. But during this period, they also had a more civic and political role. And in many ways, they actually rivaled both aristocrats and emperors in their way of ruling cities. It would, of course, it was not. It progressed through the centuries, so they became more and more powerful and more like civic leaders. And then, in the end, the well-off, Rome's well-off inhabitants. By this point of time, between the 4th and the 6th century, they would be increasingly Christian. They would have different ethnicities, because Rome was a place that would attract people from all over the world, quite literally. Some of them would probably have identified as Romans, and some of them would not. Some would be citizens, and some would not be citizens. Some would be previous slaves, and some would be free-born. And their economic background, however, would be secure. And you might think by now, well, what about, I'm saying the well-off inhabitants, but what about the poor? What about the slaves? And I really wanted to include these people as well, but the problem is that we can't see them in the sources. So I had to leave them out, even though I wanted to. So these people, they were not the poor. They lived nice lives, but some of them would have been really rich. Some of them would just have been normally so. They were not aristocrats and they didn't have political power as such, but that didn't mean they didn't have power in their own community. They could change their own community, and they could also influence power and political power indirectly by being, for example, employed in the imperial administration or that sort of stuff. So to give you a few examples of who these people could be, that could be teachers, that could be doctors, that could be traders or nuns or wealthy widows or similar things, traders. So it was a very, very, very diverse group. So, what did these people do in my 3 locations? And to figure this out, I excavated both, of course, archaeological publications and previous excavation reports. I looked in the written sources, on the inscriptions and all that sort of stuff. And I divided all the evidence that I could find where I could connect it to one of these three spaces. I could connect some sort of action going on into 18 categories. So, the first one, all my three locations had a grave of some sort. I have already mentioned it, of a founder. In Forum Romanum, it was Romulus, who was the founder of the Roman people. Then in Forum Traiani, we had Trajan, and in St. Peter's, we had St. Peter. And this connected people to this mythical past of Rome. Then, all of them were either victory monuments themselves or had victory monuments on them, which connected the people who went there with Roman history and greatness and supremacy, as I have already said. Then I could see that Christian legends were actually connected to Forum Romanum from the 4th to the 6th century and St. Peter's during the same period. So this means that I found that different Pasios, for example, martyrs stories would place these people, these martyrs, or Peter actually even, in Forum Romanum. From the 4th century, very, very early on, significantly earlier than I had thought to begin with, actually. But, as you can see, Forum Traiani is missing here, because I could not find any evidence of people connecting Forum Traiani with any Christian myths until the 7th century. Pagan ceremonies could only be, I could only find evidence of pagan ceremonies in Forum Romanum. It's not really a surprise that we didn't have anything in St. Peter's, but I would have imagined that something was going on in the Forum Traiani. It wasn't. Christian ceremonies, processions, and activities, so this was not mythical people. This was actually Christians performing Christianity in these places, of course in St. Peter's, but also in the Forum Romanum. And the same went for pilgrims, which I argue in one of my articles possibly, and this is very, very debated, because the only clear evidence we have of pilgrims in this foreign space is actually from the 8th century. But I argue that there could have been pilgrims as early as the 6th century. So that's why there's a small question mark there. And then, of course, we had pilgrims in the Basilica of St. Peter because everyone wanted to visit Peter. We had no pilgrims in the Forum Traiani. Funerary use, we have already talked a little bit about it. The Basilica of St. Peter was intended for funerary use from the very beginning, so people would come and bury their dead there, and that would be people from more or less all society's layers. Of course, we have mostly aristocratic graves, but there's also a lot of these well-off people. And in the Forum Romanum, you already met the woman who was buried there in the 6th century, and she was not alone. Then I could document that administration, politics, both church politics and you can't really say secular politics, but not Christian politics, and the publication of laws, that was obvious in all three locations. Yes, legal activities connected to crime and punishment, not executions as such, but for example, displaying executed people. That sort of stuff was not connected to Forum Traiani or St. Peter's, but it was to Forum Romanum. In contrast, seeking sanctuary, simply going into a church, for example, saying, I'm protected here because I'm inside the church. I could only find that in St. Peter's, and that might seem, obvious to some of you. You're thinking, yes, because that's the only church. But actually, there was an older tradition of people seeking sanctuaries in temples and in near imperial statues. So possibly, this could have happened in the two fora, but I couldn't find any evidence of it. Then I could see that emperors and aristocrats and kings would dedicate gifts, statues, or reparations or decorations of the different monuments in all three locations. But that, as you can see, the time differs a little bit, and also the demographic would differ a little bit. And then finally, gifts and dedications of bishops could only be found in the Forum Romanum from the 6th century and in St. Peter's throughout the period. The publications of poems and artworks could be detected in all three locations to some extent. But meanwhile, the evidence of education or schools could only be found in the Forum Traiani. That was the only place where that was really, really strong. Also, I should maybe say that the schools that I'm talking about, it's not regular children's schools. Why we have a lot of evidence of that going on in the rest of the Roman Empire, and possibly on Forum Romanum from earlier centuries. At this point of time, there was not much in Forum Romanum, nothing in St. Peter's, and Forum Traiani was only the wealthy. It was like a university. That would be the modern equivalent for the wealthy people, the aristocrats. Trade and economic activities such as money lending, storing valuables, but also just simply booths, trading booths, were visible in the Forum Romanum. Very, very clearly it became increasingly visible as we went into the 6th century. There's not much of it in the 4th, almost nothing in the 5th, a lot in the 6th. Forum Traiani, again, it was only the aristocrats storing valuables that I could actually find there. I could not find normal trade that you would all expect in a forum, but not here. The only exception to this, and this is why there's /6th century in Forum Traiani, was that the connected Athenaeum actually became a mint during the 6th century, so and possibly an imperial mint, but we're not sure about that. So there was some sort of, trade or economic activities going on by that time. But from the forum itself, the evidence is very, very weak. And like evidence of trade, the evidence of residential use was also missing from both the Basilica and the Forum Traiani. But in Forum Romanum, you could see it from the 4th century. It's a little bit shaky, that's why I have a question mark there. But it became increasingly evident, and especially during the 6th century. Equally detectable in the Forum Romanum was evidence of social use. Again, it was not that good for the 4th century. I think there can be some excavational biases here that people, when they were excavated, they didn't see the evidence. So I think it might have been there. There's something, some written sources that mention people going to the forum, talking or quarreling with each other. But the 6th century, there we really have the evidence. We have people coming there eating. Possibly it's funerary dinners, we don't know, but we have the waste from these eating dinner parties, if you like, and there are several of them in the forum from different places. And we have the dead animals as well, actually. We have people who are tossing coins, and that is really funny because we have a source from the 1st century mentioning how people would go to a special place in the forum and tossing coins to the emperor's health. So this is possibly what we can see here. Unfortunately, the coins, as far as I know, are buried somewhere in a magazine somewhere. So, and we don't know exact dates here. So it would be really interesting to study if this went on into the 6th century, but I don't know. But there was a lot of things going on here. People are coming collecting water, and you can probably imagine that they would talk, they would quarrel, they would, do whatever people do in places where everyone meets. Yes, so summing all of this up, the evidence illustrated how there was definitely differences between the three spaces. I have highlighted them here. For example, pagan ceremonies could only be found in the Forum Romanum. Legal activities could only be found in Forum Romanum. Trade, banking, and related activities were not found in the Basilica of St. Peter. Again, there might be some excavation problems here because obviously you can't really excavate that much in the area because the church is there, and the Pope doesn't want to give it up, which I kind of understand. So there might be something there, but from the sources we do have, we can't find anything. And residential use, also just the Forum Romanum, and social gatherings, also just the Forum Romanum. So there is differences. However, all of this being said, I ended up sitting with evidence that there were more similarities than there was actually differences. If you see the similarities here between the Fora and St. Peter's, you can see they have the mythical past, they have the victory monument, Christian mythification in both Forum Romanum and St. Peter's, Christian ceremonies, both places, Christian pilgrims, both places, funerary use, both places, and so I could keep going on. So that was really, really interesting. And I really want to emphasize this because the church and the fora are supposed to be two very, very different spaces. Traditionally, archaeologists treat these spaces as two very different categories. They don't mix. But this kind of suggests that the scutters, I think you can say that in English as well, is not as watertight as we would think. And something else also appeared because suddenly, when I looked at the evidence, the Forum Traiani appeared as the odd one out. I would expect that the Forum Traiani and the Forum Romanum had the most in common, and then the Basilica would be the odd one out. But as you can see here, this is the things that the Basilica and the Forum share, these things, but the Forum Traiani doesn't. Suddenly, they were very, very many. So I ended up with two places that were supposed to look like each other, who didn't look like that much like each other, and then a place that wasn't supposed to look like them at all, who looked a lot like one of them, at least. And that was really, really strange to me. So I wanted to figure out how this could be. So in my PhD, I argued that the reason why we find these similarities in activities which would normally be expected to be found in the fora, but was found in the basilica as well, was because this basilica functioned as a mnemonic monument. What you can see on the slide here is the fact that the basilica was built primarily by reused building materials. It is generally called spolia, but let's just call it reused building materials. These building materials was taken from other monuments in the city. We don't know which one in this case, but it was simply taken from places probably which went out of use. So likely none of these things were taken from the two fora that I am talking about today. The basilica's architecture as such, you might know that or might see that, was actually in some case, it was a little bit innovative. There was definitely also the very innovative thing of this being a Christian church and not a pagan temple. So there was a lot of innovation here. But despite this being evident, I argue that this basilica was actually recognizable to people because of these reused architectural building parts. And I'm not saying that people could go there and say, oh, that column is from the temple or blah, 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 or that it wasn't that, but they could just simply look at this space and then they could go and look at the rest of the city or the fora and see that it looked similar. And to use a modern word, I think that this would nudge them to believe that similar things could go on in these similar spaces. They looked alike, so why not act alike? For example, if we go into a classroom, none of us would start dancing on the tables. We know we don't do that in classrooms. Instead, you sit down and you are probably talking a little bit quietly and you're waiting for the teacher to come in. And I think it's kind of the same thing that was going on here. People were used to doing that these activities that I just showed you in the fora, in spaces that looked like this. So now when they entered this place, it didn't seem that strange to them that they could do similar things there. So what it did was that, or what I argue in my PhD is that this kind of visualized Christianity as a natural continuation of the past. And this, you could say, materialization of memory, they make this place appropriate for fora activities. And additionally, what we could say, I didn't mention that before, but what we could see was that these activities was actually, they were becoming more and more of them as this period progressed. So possibly, when the first activities had been connected to this place, they would kind of attract similar activities, and that would kind of confirm this development. So they would legitimize, you could say, new activities being attracted here, and thus it would become more and more closely tied to civic activities such as the one I just showed you. However, the question was, if this was happening in the church, where did it leave the two fora? Because as I have said during this talk, a lot of change was happening during the 4th to the 6th centuries. And the written sources are very clear on that spaces like these two fora were very important in kind of showing the Roman people that still, even though all these changes were happening, everything was still more or less the same. Rome was still glorious. Rome was still, the ideal. And we can therefore also see in written sources that emperors, rulers, even barbaric rulers actually, again and again say how they want to preserve these places. These places specifically needs to be preserved because then you will preserve Roman culture, whatever that is. But nevertheless, you can actually see when you look at the activities and you look at the archaeological material that while they're talking about they're almost saying cultural heritage. They're almost calling these places cultural heritage. And while they talk about cultural heritage being in itself important enough to be preserved, we can see in the archaeological sources, in the activities taking place there, that actually what was preserved, or what they prioritized at least, was the buildings that were used in the daily life of the city. So that would be buildings connected to trade, for example, buildings connected to political activities, way more down to earth than ideological reasons you can see in the written sources. Yes, and when this happened, and I could see kind of this development in the sources, all of this idea of preserving the things that you were using in your daily life, I found it very, very interesting that at the same time, suddenly I couldn't see restorations from the Forum Traiani. So if this space was still in use, why was nobody repairing it? Because you would imagine that it would need repairing as 200 years went by, if people were using it regularly. The evidence suggested that as churches provided new locations for many of the activities one would traditionally find in one of these fora, memory was simply not sufficient enough to keep these spaces relevant, and they were not sufficient enough for them to be repaired. And in this case, I therefore argued that the Forum Traiani was an example of what happened when memory prevented a space from developing, because you could see it in the sources. People were talking about this place as more beautiful, a miracle. That's even used, that word. It was so beautiful. It was so important to kind of preserve. But it was always the elite. I could never find normal people actually using it. And now it becomes important that in the 6th century, the elite is fleeing. The emperor has left the building a long time ago, but then suddenly the aristocrats are leaving as well due to the Gothic wars. And then who's left? And I think it began actually already in the 5th century, because by then many people, also the aristocrats, were becoming increasingly Christian. And what I could see in the activities when I began to identify the actors was that I had an increase of aristocratic activities going on in the Basilica of St. Peter, and at the same time, almost, I can't go into specific dates, but almost there was a specific decrease in aristocratic activities going on in the Forum Traiani. So that seems to suggest to me that at this point of time, by around the middle of the 5th century, the last part of the 5th century, people wanted to take their daily business into places that were connected directly with Christianity. And Forum Traiani simply wasn't, because that was kept exactly as it had always been, as this victory monument, this mythological monument of Roman supremacy, and Christianity has nothing to do there. Even when I can occasionally find a Christian being in that space, he never there's actually only one, and he doesn't identify himself as a Christian. We only know that he's a Christian from other sources, but he put up a statue there exactly like a pagan would have done, never mentioning one word that he's actually a Christian, and not just any Christian, but a very prominent Christian, who was incidentally buried in St. Peter's later, but that's another story. But on the other hand, I have Forum Romanum, as you can see on this slide, where I could pinpoint a lot of explicitly Christian things going on. I already went through some of them: myths, ceremonies, processions, Christians acting like Christians in the Forum. It was very important for my study that it was not enough that a person was a Christian, and in the Forum he or she had to act as a Christian. Otherwise, Christianity would not be visible as such. And as you can see, during the period, there was increasingly Christian activities going on in this space. So for some reason, this space was flexible, adaptable enough to actually incorporate Christianity, which was a little bit surprising because there's nothing more pagan, you would say, than the heart of Rome, Forum Romanum. So you wouldn't expect it, but nevertheless. But Christianity did not do it alone. Because as I have already mentioned a couple of times, during the last part of this period, we can remove our top elite from the city. The aristocrats killed or fled for Constantinople. The emperor had left a long time ago. These guys are dead by now. So what did that leave us with? That left us with Rome's well-off inhabitants and the bishop. And it seems like it's almost as if they were just waiting for this to happen, because as soon as these other actors are out, bam, we have the Pope very, very prominently in St. Peter's. Of course, he claimed that space very quickly. And I argue in my PhD, actually, that what is happening here in the last part of my period in the 6th century is the beginning of the St. Peter's becoming the papal church as it would become in the Middle Ages, that this is actually happening here. It wasn't at the time, but this is where the tipping point was, if you like. And meanwhile, while we can't see that at all in the Forum Traiani, and again, of course, I have to say that it might have something to do with excavations and all that sort of stuff, but I couldn't find my well-off inhabitants at all in Forum Traiani, while I could find them, as I have already mentioned, in the Forum Romanum. Increasingly, I have trading booths, and it's not, huge stores. It's literally a table you would take and put in the forum and display your wares, like shoes or food or fruit or whatever. So it's not big trading adventures that we have there. We will have these dinners, as I already talked about. We have people buried there. We have people living there. Several monuments were suddenly changed into smaller apartments. So they are in there. So I argue that not only Christianity is very important for seeing the development of these three spaces, but actually the well-off are just as important. The rest of Rome's citizens who have not received near the attention that they actually deserve. And this, in the end, resulted in Forum Romanum surviving. The Basilica of St. Peter got a new patron in the Pope, so that space was, handled as well. But Forum Traiani was suddenly just left as a space in the city where nobody could be, because the aristocrats and the emperors had kept their control of it so tightly until they left, and then it just wasn't relevant to anyone else. And this also shows that the people of Rome, possibly emperors and aristocrats, had this idea of Rome being exactly as it always was, very imperial, very, big and fantastic. But the people of Rome, they were more pragmatic in their way of, approaching these monuments. And if they had to change a big monument in a way so they could use it, fine, no problem. Even if that change was really, really, really radical, like, for example, burying your grandmother in the Forum. And in that, in that aspect, actually, the city lived on, this space lived on, because dead people were introduced there. That's a little paradoxical to me. And with that, we are back with the dead woman in the Forum. And I think she would be very, very amazed if she knew that I am arguing today that she is actually more important, or at least as important as the big temples in the Forum, to understand how these spaces developed during this time. Nevertheless, I think if we focus on these spaces and avoid getting dazzled by these fantastic monuments, and it's really, really hard. If any of you have been to any of these spaces, they're fantastic. But if we can just for a second step back from this grandeur and this image that emperors and aristocrats who built these spaces, they wanted to kind of project to us, then we can actually look at the normal people, the people who were there, the people who used them. And that way, I think we can understand how Rome was developing during this period. And possibly, we can even question fine and clean, pristine, white reconstructions, as the one I have shown you a lot of in this talk, because that was not the reality of Rome. Whether we like it or not, waste, graves, dinner parties, people getting drunk, all that sort of stuff was part of Rome, and that was what really kept Rome alive. And if we remember this, I think we can understand these spaces much, much better. And to be honest, I think that is a worthy legacy of a dead woman in a Forum. Thank you for your attention.
Tusind tak, Christina. Ja, hvem havde troet, at det kunne være så interessant at studere Rom? Fra en forhistorisk arkeolog. Nej, men det var virkelig, altså, jeg har jo set flere af dine oplæg, men jeg synes faktisk, det her er det bedste. Også fordi man får hele... Ja, de var gode før også. Men jeg synes, det altså... I hvert fald for mig, som ikke kender noget om det, at man får hele introduktionen, og det, altså, det er virkelig... jeg har overbevist dig. Ja, det har du. Ja, det synes jeg virkelig godt. Så ja.
Tusind tak.
Ja. Er der spørgsmål?
Skal vi tage et spørgsmål på engelsk, eller hvad skal jeg svare?
Ja, English, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish. Ja. English, dorsk og... Danish and Norwegian.
I'll ask my question in English.
Yes. Yeah, so Daniela has a question.
Thank you. At least it's not in German. I was very much impressed. I liked your argument about this sort of bottom-up Christianity taking over the spaces of former power. But I was wondering whether you can say a little bit more about not just the spaces, but what went on there as we're coming up to Christmas, like the taking over of pagan holidays and festivities and celebrations and stuff. Did that come from the bottom up as well, or was there like a top-down component to all that?
See, that is actually really, really interesting, because what we can see is while during this period people become more and more Christian, there are some pagan celebrations, holidays that actually keeps on going. And of course, some of them are driven by the well-off or the normal people of Rome who just love having a good time. But we can also see it in the elite sources as well. So there we have kind of both. We have these bishops, one bishop in particular, who is raging against these pagan ceremonies. He's like, how can you go there? How can you do this? You are such bad Christians, and it's horrible. And then we have these aristocratic people who are Christians who are saying, no, it has nothing to do with religion. This is tradition, and it's very important. People like it. It's funny. Come on. And it's not a problem at all. And we have this, the whole idea about eating stuff from pagan sacrifices, like you also, that whole debate also, where they're like, well, you can do that. It's not a problem because we don't believe in the gods, so, it's just meat. But the bishop doesn't agree. But it's very interesting because we can't really see that he won the argument. What we can see is that some of these parties actually went on throughout the period. So different forces are really competing here. And I don't think at any point in this period there was, everything could change. And there was nothing could be taken for granted. And Christians, even they have a Christian emperor by now, but still he doesn't decide to go down and say, you can't have these parties. He's like, well, let them. Why? What's the problem? And of course it differs with the emperor because some are more Christian than others. And there's also different Christianities going into the mix. So it gets even more excited. So there's not a clear a clear development there that you can trace. You have these small traces here and there. And to be honest, but that's my personal opinion. But I think that people have been, again, very pragmatic. They have been like, this is fantastic party. Why shouldn't we have it? Yes, I'm Christian and I, pray to God every day and I give him so many gifts and all that stuff. So can I please just have this party? And you can kind of see them, discussing this and trying to justify that. But we can't tell, exactly. The way the emperor, you were talking about a bottom up or a top down, the way the emperor tries to kind of implement Christianity. Again, this depends on the emperor because you have Justinian, who's kind of more rough than other emperors. But for example, Constantine, he would rather, again, use the modern word notch. He would make it easier to be Christian. Yes, you can, if you get this, if you want to get this office, it would just be better if you were Christian. And then people are like, in the end, it happens. People become Christian. And of course, there's still aristocrats who are like, no, I will never be Christian and all that sort of stuff. We have fanatics on both sides. But in the beginning, it's much more nudging people to do what you want, at least in Rome. And then when you have, persecutions of pagan people in the rest of the empire where it gets violent and that sort of stuff. This is not my area of expertise, but it's usually the bishop and it's, and fanatics, Christian fanatics of different sorts, saints and all that sort of stuff. And then normal people suddenly just snapping and then, it went off. So there's a lot of different things happening, so, to make a very long answer short.
Any other question? Ja, Søren.
Jeg tager på dansk. Jeg synes, det var vældig interessant, og jeg tror, det er vigtigt at få den type detaljer frem om Rom. Som forhistorisk arkeolog burde, jeg kender nok lidt til Rom, men de fleste forhistoriske arkeologer burde jo have et vældig godt kendskab til Rom. Men i virkeligheden, så har vi egentlig ikke det. Når vi taler om Rom, som den her stad, der lever i 1000 år, så tager vi en kort periode i 100-tallet, første århundrede efter. Og det er vores Rom, og det er det, vi ligesom bruger for dem som manen. Men sandheden er jo, at før vores tidsregning af Rom i mange århundreder ikke noget særligt at tale om. Mange græske byer er faktisk meget, meget mere imponerende. Og når vi kommer hen mod slutningen af Rom, jamen, så er der faktisk heller ikke så meget at skrive om længere der. Men den her myten om Rom, den lever så uendelig godt, og det har han jo også gjort i forhistorien. Skønt eksempel er jo historien om en af Ragnar Lodbrogs sønner, der sætter sig for, at han skal ned til Middelhavet og plyndre Rom. Sejler han afsted med 400 skibe, og det går ikke sådan specielt godt. Om det er rigtigt eller forkert, om det var Rom, han ville ned efter. Han havde jo, historien er, at han finder den ikke. Men bare historien om, at Rom var værd at plyndre. Det var sikkert ikke værd at plyndre på det tidspunkt. Der var mange byer, der var mere værd at plyndre. Så vi har sådan en vældig stereotyp opfattelse af, hvad Rom er. At det var den her store by med stærkt militær, ledt af kejsere. I nogle perioder må man jo sige, at det er jo fantastisk, at byen overlevede på grund af de her umulige kejsere og umulige regenter. Men det var formodentlig, fordi man havde en meget stor stand af embedsfolk og købmænd og almindelige borgere. Det var dem, der drev byen. Og at der så kommer en form for demokratisering til sidst, hvor de overtager byen, det er jo bare herligt.
Jamen, det er faktisk det er rigtig interessant. It's very interesting actually. The whole thing of you have two very interesting points. First, you're saying that the city was maybe not, at this point of time, or maybe later even, you were talking a little bit about the Middle Ages, it was not worth actually sacking. And what I want just to say there that, yes, Rome was definitely not as worth sacking as it was in the 1st century, but it was still a big city. By the end of my period, it's still one of the biggest cities in the world. Chinese, they had some big cities as well, don't forget. But in Europe, this is a fantastic big city. And actually, that might even be the problem of Rome. Maybe you could say that it was, in Danish you would say, den sejrer sig ihjel. It becomes so big, it becomes so huge, that it becomes impossible to sustain. And also the whole idea about Rome being not being sackable, if you like, is also, that was a very, very strong idea, and probably that protected it for a very, very long time, because in the end, as you saw with the 3 sacks that I just mentioned, and this was just 3 out of many, if you actually go to Rome, if you get down through Italy, Rome is very, very hard to defend. So it is, even in Augustan time, but at that time they didn't do it. Maybe because this myth was so big. They did in the Republic. It did happen there. The other thing you said, now I forgot. Hvad var det andet du sagde?
Demokratiseringen af byen.
Yes. The other thing you said, yes, the city was, the way it was run was, of course, there was this emperor, and during a long periods, he would be there before my period, and he would, some emperors would be very hands-on, and some emperors would not. And we can see the same in my period, that some of the emperors are very hands-on. They expect that the aristocracy, the local aristocracy, the man on the ground, so to speak, that he reports to the emperor. He writes him again and again and tell exactly what is going on. And I have this fantastic letter of an aristocrat who is writing to, he's not an emperor at the time, but he's talking about how he failed to kind of keep an uprising down. And it's so clear that he hates writing this letter because it makes him look so bad to the coming emperor. But he had to, and that kind of shows that there was this control. Even though the emperor was sitting in Constantinople, he was very hands-on. He could be very hands-on. On the other hand, Theodoric, as I mentioned, he's also one of these rulers who likes to be hands-on. You can see it in the letters. He even gets himself, into this problem with a specific statue that has been stolen from a specific small city in Italy, and he is like very hands-on, and we need to get that statue back and kill the people who did it, and blah, blah, blah. And he has a lot to say, but the funny thing is people is not doing what he's saying. So we can actually see that he's writing, not in that instance, but in other instances, he gives orders through his letters, and then he's writing new letters saying, come on, do what I said. And then he's writing new letters. I'm really, really terrified you're not doing what I said. And it keeps on going. So that's really interesting. You can kind of see this play. And sometimes it kind of topples over where the aristocracy realizes, hey, the emperor is sitting in Constantinople, and the ruler, our Gothic ruler, whatever, he's sitting up there in Ravenna. So we can basically do whatever we like, and then they do whatever they like. And that's really fantastic, and I think that's also becoming clear when you take these different sources and kind of compare them, because the written sources say one thing, but suddenly the epigraphical sources or the archaeological sources say something completely different. And we have people buried in the Forum where they're not supposed to be. So but it's a long discussion.
Yeah, about the sources actually, like which sources have you used most, or like how much of the archaeological sources have you used for the different categories you were listing?
I'm not quite.
You said you used written sources and epigraphic and archaeological.
Yeah.
Like, what's the percentage of?
I try to use them equally. I haven't done a percentage, but my whole idea was, it's because it's very, especially in old research, not now. People today know that you should use these sources more or less equally, but you can read old scholarship where they're like, well, we can trust the written sources better. Or for example, people going to the Forum Romanum with written sources in their hand and then digging the forum. And yeah, obviously they're finding what they're searching for. So yeah, but I try to kind of forget that and kind of, because I am a trained archaeologist, so I would of course tend to favor the archaeological sources, but I try to always be very clear that I have this bias and then look at them equally. But of course there's, to answer your questions, there's from the different activities, it's very different if the main part of the evidence is written or if it's archaeological. For example, the social use, it's very clearly archaeological sources that we have to look to. It's ceramics, it's bones, that sort of stuff, coins and all that things there. While for Christian myths, I can find almost nothing in the archaeological sources. It's very, very, very rare that we have something there. So that would be mainly written sources. And then there's something like trading, where it's kind of both sources complementing each other and the epigraphical sources coming in as well. The dedication is the same. You can both find written sources, but also archaeology. So the different groups, it depends on the different groups. And what I found, because activity spaces, the theory that I use is actually, surprise, it's not developed for archaeological interpretation. It's developed for looking at modern cities. It's a sociological theory. And in that case, they would, try to make everything statistically, or what's the word? So you can kind of look at it again and do percentages and that sort of stuff. And it just doesn't really make sense here because I get such a fragmentary picture. And of course, everything I say, you need to keep that in mind because a few new sources discovered or something that I have overlooked because there's a massive amount of evidence here can change some of these things drastically. Some things I would argue cannot be changed because there's so much evidence pointing this way. For example, I would be really, really surprised if if we found a lot of new evidence of Christians in the Forum Traiani. But it might happen, and because everything is so fragmentary, just a small piece of evidence could kind of change the way we look at it. So I would love for it to be, but sometimes we have to just work with what we got. I think you know that.
Yeah, you have way more than what we have, so.
At least they are privileged.
Yeah. Are there any questions from the chat? No? Are there other questions here? No? I was thinking the guy from you said this Christian guy from the Forum Traiani, who was he?
He was an aristocrat, and he was a very prominent one of the ones we know from actually different sources, because we have his grave inscription. He was buried not in the St. Peter's, but as close as you can. Literally, he and his wife, or it was his wife, built a mausoleum right next to Peter's grave, as close as they could come to the church. And that mausoleum, unfortunately, was torn down in the 16th century, but the sculptures there, sarcophagi, and the inscriptions are still there. So we know his name, we know his career, we know him also from written sources, where I think it's his eulogy, that would be his praise after his death, has been recorded in written sources, I think. And then we have this statue in the Forum Traiani, where he is praised for being an aristocrat in very, very traditional terms, and let's put this statue up. And nowhere do they mention that he's actually a very, very prominent Christian who will be buried near St. Peter's. And we need to know that, not everyone could get that prominent a burial place next to St. Peter's. It's like, it's a hierarchy. The closer you are to St. Peter's, the better you have done for yourself. And he's literally as close as you can get. But in the Forum Traiani, he's not Christian at all. And that's kind of interesting. So it also shows some kind of schizophrenia in the identity of the elite at the point, where sometimes you needed to be less Christian and sometimes maybe more Christian.
Okay. Do we have questions, or are we done for today? I think we're done. But thank you, Christina. It was really, really interesting. So
You're welcome.
yeah, last Claire. And thank you for the ones that joined us online. Yes, see you next time.